Hello, this is Landscape Architecture 316, Woody Plants in the Landscape. And this is our first video of a plant tour. And this is going to be what we're going to be doing every week for the next 12 weeks. Welcome to my world, which is a world filled with plants. I can't see you, and I don't know what kind of plants you have around you, but I want to introduce you to the plants that are common in Vancouver and plants that you're going to need to get to know at least a little bit because we're expecting at some point this madness to be over and everybody's going to be joining us here in Vancouver. So I want to give you, in this course, I want to give you some of the tools that you can use to help you to recognize plants. And we're going to be talking about plants in the context of the landscape. That is, how do they fit and what's appropriate and maybe what's not appropriate. I'm not going to talk a lot about aesthetics. I think people look at plants and say, geez, I love that, or boy, I don't like that. And that's not my role. My role here is to introduce you to plants, give you the tools to be able to recognize what it is you're looking at, and to understand why plants work in the landscape ecologically. So we're going to start out by talking about some plants and the ways that we recognize those plants. And usually the first place that I start is in talking about leaf shape, because leaves are perhaps the most obvious feature of plants. And we're standing here in a garden. This is the botanical garden at the university, and we're going to be doing most of our videotaping in the garden. We'll do a little bit on campus as well. And so behind the camera, Ben Eisenberg is your TA, my TA, and I'm just lucky that he's good at the video part of this, and that leaves my hands free, and I get to pick up plants and show them around. So we're going to start right away with the first plant, which is not the first plant alphabetically on your list, but the first plant that we come to, which is Styrax japonicus. Now I'm going to be talking about plants primarily using scientific names. And scientific names are important for a number of reasons, not least that they are more or less unambiguous. Whereas when people use common names, whether that's a recognized common name or a regional common name, these are names that are often ambiguous. Things like a good example of that is the name cedar. Lots of cultures use the word cedar, that is English-speaking cultures use the word cedar, and it's a name that refers to wood that's aromatic. And so all kinds of things are named cedar. We want to stay away from common names to identify plants, but we have to use common names if we're going to communicate with people who are maybe less familiar with the scientific names. So now some of you are from temperate climates, and in a temperate climate, particularly in a northern temperate climate, we have seasonal deciduousness that's a result of cold temperatures and a reduction in light levels in toward the winter. In other parts of the world, There are other reasons for deciduousness. You could have, for example, dry deciduous plants. That is, they drop their leaves in anticipation of drought. But generally speaking, all of the plants that we're going to be looking at in this course are woody plants. That is, they have an above ground permanent structure, shrubs and trees, and they'll either be evergreen or deciduous. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about these sort of basic concepts, but I've posted in Canvas, I've posted some files that I think will be very helpful to you. And in fact, I'm inviting you to have a look at those files as soon as maybe you're able, and read through those. And if you have questions about anything you see in those files, the internet is a wonderful thing, but there's also our Zoom sessions, which are held on Fridays. And the Zoom session, you can ask questions about if you're unclear about terminology, for example. And again, a lot of this terminology I think will be familiar to many people, and if it's not familiar, there are lots of resources that I'm talking about. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, that plants are normally categorized in two ways. They either have leaves that alternate along the stems. You can see it's doing that here. You have a leaf here, 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 there, and you can see the buds. I think you can probably see the little buds in where the leaf and the stem come together. This is called a leaf axil, A-X-I-L. The bud is in the leaf axil, and this is an alternate arrangement sometimes, and we're going to see that in another plant today, or a number of plants today. The leaves occur opposite each other, more like this. And when they're opposite, there are certain plants that produce only oppositely arranged leaves, and certain plants that only have alternately arranged leaves. When we're identifying plants, we often go through a process of elimination. We look at a plant and we say, well, it's got alternate leaves, it has, those leaves are simple, that is, they just have like one blade and a stalk, and the buds don't have any bud scales. It's very useful to write down all of these things and create, if you can, create tables that show the differences between plants. And you start to see patterns develop when you do that. Now, we're only looking at just over 100 plants this term. And so that's a fairly, I think, a fairly reasonable amount of plants to get to know. I want you to feel confident that despite the fact that you're not here with me, that you're going to be able to recognize these plants. And we're going to try and show you as much as we can to help you to recognize them. The plant that I have in front of me here is Styrax japonicus, obviously from Japan. It's also not merely from Japan, but also found in Korea and in China as well. And in English, it's known as the Japanese snow bell. And it's called a snow bell because the flowers are sort of bell-shaped, but they're white, which alludes to the snow. They don't come out when it's snowy. This is a deciduous tree, that is, it loses its leaves seasonally. It has leaves that have individual stems, and that leaf has a particular shape. We're going to describe that shape in a second, but I want you to look at the leaf and notice that there's a kind of a broad part and there's a stalk. And the stalk we'll call a petiole, and the broad part we'll call the blade or the lamina. And it's attached to a branch, and on that branch we have multiple leaves. And we're going to have a close-up look. Ben's going to do a close-up of the buds and some of the details. But one of the easy ways to recognize styrax is that when you're looking at the buds are merely tiny leaves that are pressed close together. There are no what we call bud scales that surround the buds. Bud scales are a very common protection for emerging buds. And so we look at the styrax and we see that it has a particular kind of leaf shape. When we feel it, you can't feel it obviously, but it's a papery leaf. And the stems, on very, very close inspection, you would see some hairs on there. And when we differentiate plants, we're looking for a variety of features. We're looking at what we call vestiture. Vestiture just means clothing. And vestiture on a plant can be waxes or scales, little loose bits, or it could be hairs, and it could be different kinds of hairs. And so as we go through the course, we'll start to see a little bit more variation in some of these things. The leaf shape, this is a pretty typical, this is very hard to do because these leaves are a little bit folded, but the leaf shape is a kind of classic ovate shape, that is egg-shaped, and it's pointed, and there are teeth along the margins, but the teeth along the margins are not very prominent. The overall look of the plant is quite densely foliated, lots of leaves, but you'll also notice something else when you're looking at the styrax at this time of the year, and that is we see fruits. And these fruits are nuts. They're little nuts, and they follow flowers that appeared in the springtime. And at this time of the year, we have to look for the fruit to sort of readily identify styrax. But in the spring, the flowers are so distinctive, they run along the undersides of the branches, and they're very, very abundant. And so before they appear before the leaves emerge in the spring, and so you have the tree is sort of festooned with small white 5-petaled flowers, and in the center of the flower is a yellow group of stamens, and the stamens are the pollen-bearing structures in a flower. So styrax is grown. It's actually a very popular tree. It's popular as a residential tree for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a fairly small tree. Most of the styrax that we see in the landscape are no more than maybe 6 or 7 meters after 25 years. It is it's an easy plant, tolerates a little bit of shade, but it's a better plant in the open. There are some limitations to styrax, and one of them is that it requires some summer moisture. If it doesn't have summer moisture, then it doesn't do very well. It needs well-drained soil, but it also needs cool soil. And that means that it needs to have the soil around its roots shaded. And if it doesn't have that, then it tends to be short-lived. And what that does is that it excludes it from being a good street tree or a good kind of urban tree. It's much better as a suburban tree, good on the north side of a building, for example, in a turf area where roots are not going to be compacted by a lot of traffic. Otherwise, it's a pest and disease-free tree. Is very, very popular these days. So this is our next plant. This is Colereturia paniculata. Colereturia is a genus of trees, not very many in the genus. Most of them are subtropical. And so those of you who are perhaps in China, you might be familiar with another kind of Colereturia. But this is the Colereturia that we grow locally. And Colereturia is fairly easy to recognize by the compound leaves. Now, I showed you simple leaves prior to this. Compound leaves are leaves where there are multiple blades or multiple lamina on a stalk. So the base of the leaf, which is here, and if we look closely, and we'll get a shot of that in a minute, if we look closely at the way that the leaf arises from the stem, you'll see that in Colereturia there's a little bit of a thickening at the base of the leaf, and look at all these lamina. They're a little bit folded up now because it's dry at the end of the year. This is a compound leaf, and we call this a pinnately compound leaf because the leaflets are like the pinny in a feather. And so if you know what a feather looks like, all those little bits on either side of the central stalk and a feather, those are called pinnae, P-I-N-N-A-E. That's the plural. Pinna is the singular. And so on a compound leaf like this, on a pinnately compound leaf, we can call these leaflets, but we can also call them pinnae. And the central stalk is known as the rachis, R-A-C-H-I-S. Now, Colereturia is pretty easy to recognize at this time of the year because of these fruits. And these fruits are dry and papery, and inside this dry, papery fruit, you'll find seeds. The seeds are little black seeds. And people in eastern North America know this plant as an invasive species. And what happens is that in snowy winter climates in particular, these blow off and they roll around on the snow until they open and drop their seeds, and then the seeds basically make their way through the snow and have ideal conditions to germinate and produce new seedlings in the spring. Here in Vancouver, this doesn't happen. We don't have a lot of snow, but it's much too wet, and the seeds typically rot before they grow. Colereturia is noted for its, and I'm just going to grab a branch here just so that I can give you, this is not something I encourage you to do, it's to break branches off. We have an alternate leaf arrangement, and we have the buds that are arranged in the axils. The buds actually have little bud scales, and you'd need to look very, very closely at that. But as I say, it's fairly easy to recognize because of this display of dry fruits. Now, the name Colereturia derives from an old German botanist named Kohlreuter, and the second part of the name, paniculata, refers to the type of flower stalk that this produces, which is a panicle. And a panicle is a branched, what we call an inflorescence. Inflorescence is just the term we use for a stalk with multiple flowers, and this is a branched inflorescence, as you can see. In the summertime, in the early summer, say late June or early July, these panicles are covered in yellow flowers, and that's where it gets the common name, the golden rain tree, because this is absolutely festooned with yellow flowers. Very, very showy summer flowering tree. Now you'll notice that this is a fairly round-headed tree. It's a small tree. It's a little bit like Styrax in terms of its size, maybe a little bit broader and lower. And it's used in places where Styrax can't grow, certainly. It's very, very well adapted to urban situations. It tolerates dry soil and reflected heat. And so it's a very, very useful plant to have where irrigation is either not existing or there's very little irrigation. Our next plant is one that's maybe a little bit unusual. It's a very, very well adapted plant to Vancouver's climate. It's known as Chitalpa tashkentensis. Tashkent is a city in the former Soviet Union, and there was a big botanical institute there, and a botanist created this plant at the Tashkent Botanical Garden, which is why it has the specific epithet tashkentensis. Whenever you see that ENSIS at the end of a word, you know it's a geographical ending. It means from that place. Now, Chitalpa is pretty easy to recognize. It has leaves that I would describe as lance-shaped or lance head shaped, narrow and long. They're actually tapered at both ends, which is a little bit unlike lance. Lance shaped more like that. But anyway, narrow leaves, narrow pointed leaves, very, very green. And again, this is another summer flowering tree. These flowers are a little bit frilly, kind of lavender in color. Now, the reason I say this is a great plant for Vancouver is that it's drought tolerant, it's sun tolerant, it's attractive to hummingbirds and to other pollinators as well. It has a fairly open crown, nice rounded crown like Choroturia, and just like Choroturia in the winter, once it loses its leaves, it has a fairly open crown, which means that there's a lot of light that comes through. Now, I don't know about you, but in Vancouver, in the winter, we are desperate for light. Now, evergreen trees are abundant here, but deciduous trees that have open crowns are very, very useful because we get more light to the ground. Now, I want to show you that Chitalpa, Chitalpa, has what are known as whorled leaves. That is, 3 leaves arising from approximately the same place on the stem. And occasionally you will find 2 leaves arising at the same place on the stem, or sometimes a little bit offset. I don't know if you can see that, a little bit offset. So Chitalpa would be classified as having oppositely arranged or whorled leaves. There's not a lot to say about the autumn color with Chitalpa. It's really grown for its summer display, and it's a very, very tough plant. It'll grow in any kind of urban situation that we want, but it's a good size for residential gardening as well. So this is one of the most unusual trees that we grow. It's unusual for a number of reasons. It's known as the ginkgo. That's a common name and its scientific name, Ginkgo biloba. It's a little bit of a misnomer because when you're looking at the leaves of the ginkgo, only about 2% of them are actually bilobed, and that would be an example of a bilobed leaf, 2 lobes. Most of them have sort of irregular toothing on the edge. But you'll notice that this is a very, very unusual shape for a leaf. The technical name for this is flabellate. Flabellate means fan-shaped, and so if you know what a handheld fan is like, you can understand that. But the ginkgo is distinctive mostly because it has what we call the long shoot, short shoot morphology. Morphology just means shape. But the long shoots, you can see the long shoots, they're usually the leading shoots on the ends of branches. And you can see that they have alternately arranged leaves and buds. But they also have these curious short shoots, which are kind of stocky, short branches that produce a little kind of rosette of leaves at the tips. And if you look at the branches are all covered in these short shoots. And so the branch itself looks very, very well clothed in leaves. It's not like branches on, let's call them normal trees that don't have short shoots, where you just have one leaf here and one leaf here. But there's a lot of leaf here. Now, ginkgos have been around for something in the order of 260 million years, and they've mostly unchanged since those times. And so in the fossil record, we see ginkgos, and it's very easy to recognize ginkgos. There were more than just ginkgo biloba over the millions of years. But I guess the thing to talk about with ginkgo is we look at not only what it looks like, it's easy to recognize, but it's a kind of an iconic tree. It was planted around Buddhist temples in China. It's originally from China, but 50 million years ago it was more widespread around the world. Anyway, it appears to be, if not extinct in the wild, then nearly extinct in the wild. But it's incredibly adaptable, and I guess after 260 million years, the ginkgos kind of figured it out, how to survive. And so it will grow in almost any conditions other than in heavy shade or in saturated soil. And so again, this is a very, very good urban tree. The limitations, and there are two sort of major limitations, are that it's a very, very large kind of spreading, gawky tree, and we'll see that when you see a shot from a little further away. But the second thing is that this is a tree that is, this is a male tree, and there are female trees. And when trees have different sexed individuals, we call those dioecious. Dioecious means two houses. And the female of the species produces a seed that's covered in flesh that when it ripens, it putrefies. It becomes so smelly as to be really off-putting. Now, it was probably very, very attractive to dinosaurs or some other animal that could disperse the seeds. But nowadays, it only attracts people who know that it's very, very tasty, and it's actually, the seed is very valuable. In fact, medicinally, it's what we call a vasodilator. It opens the blood vessels, which is why people think that it helps with cognitive ability. So it's basically getting more oxygen to the brain. The other thing is that it's great in soup. So the next plant I want to talk about is Stewartia pseudocamellia. Stewartia is named for the, I don't know, I think it was the 4th Earl of Bute, somebody Stewart. Most plant names, they're named after old white guys. This can be somewhat embarrassing, but I think you'll get the hang of it after a while. Pseudocamellia refers to the fact that pseudo means false, of course, and camellia refers to the shape of the flowers. The flowers of Stewartia pseudocamellia look like camellias, and so it's the false camellia. Interestingly, it's in the same family as camellia, which is why the flowers look the way they do. But in terms of recognition, in terms of field recognition, Stewartia pseudocamellia is pretty easy to recognize by the beautiful peeling bark. And you can see this is actually quite thick bark that peels away, and you can see these lovely patterns and textures. And this is a lot of landscape architects fall in love with this tree as a result of the bark alone, but the bark is not the only thing that the Stewartias got going for it. Stewartias also have pretty pest and disease-free leaves. The leaves always look pretty good. In terms of leaf shape and arrangement, this is more or less an elliptic leaf, and the arrangement is alternate. The leaves are toothed. We'll get a good close-up shot of that so you can see that. And the buds are very long and pointed, and those are easy ways to recognize Stewartia when you're not looking at the bark, or in fact when you're looking at a young plant. Landscape architects love the plant for good reason, but there are always limitations to anything good. And the limitation for Stewartia is very much like Styrax. It is a woodland plant. It's much better adapted to a little bit of shade, like planting on the north side of a building, for example, if you're in the northern hemisphere, and keeping people off the roots. It likes moisture in the summer and well-drained soil, and it's if you can give it those things, then it's a spectacular plant. But it's not the kind of thing you want to plant on a street or in the in sort of dirty urban context. Our next tree is Cercidophyllum japonicum, another Japanese species that also occurs in China. And this is, well, as you can see, this is fairly distinctive, pretty easy to recognize. And I want to introduce a new concept to you, and that is the term disticus, D-I-S-T-I-C-H-U-S, disticus, which means in two ranks. And you can see that the leaves, which are oppositely arranged, run down the branches in two perfect ranks. And this is a strategy to maximize light interception in the shade. And when you see Cercidophyllum in the sun, the leaves are not so flat. They typically will drop down a little just so they don't get burned. But this is again, is fairly distinctive. We have some opposite leaves, and then occasionally we have what we call a sub-opposite arrangement, where something goes haywire in the machinery, and it's not completely opposite, but a little bit off opposite. And that sub-opposite look is fairly common with Katsura. If you look at the leaves, you'll see that they're variable. This is, I would call that a broadly ovate leaf, and then some of these older leaves down here are more, they're almost round, and so we would call those orbicular. The edge of the leaf is toothed, and the teeth are blunted. They're rounded, and that's we call that a crenate tooth. So these have crenate margins, and you'll notice that most of the leaves also have what we would call a cordate base, that is with two lobes on either side of the attachment of the lamina to the petiole. The tree is an elegant tree. It's a very, very strongly upright tree with lateral branches that droop. Again, another woodland tree. This can be grown in the full sun as long as there's plenty of water in the summertime. And this is a tree that we often sadly see getting crispy because people are not watering it in the summer. If it doesn't have water, or if it's not in the shade, it's not going to do very well. But where the conditions are right, it's a magnificent tree. It's pest and disease free. With better light, it has great autumn color in sort of almost flame colors. It is renowned for the smell, the aroma of the leaves as they break down. They produce sugar known as maltose, and that smells to people like cotton candy or burnt sugar, it's one of those aromas that sort of takes you away. It's such a pleasant aroma, and I can only say that Katsura, which is the common name, is an ideal tree, but only if you have a moist summer situation. So this is Acer palmatum. Acer palmatum is one of the most popular of all residential scale ornamental trees. And one of the reasons that it's as popular as it is that it's variable. And the plant that I'm showing you here is sort of typical in one sense, but in another sense there are sort of three typical forms that you'll see. And we'll go over that as we go on in the term. But just suffice to say, this has all of the characters that I want you to try and remember for Acer palmatum. You'll notice that the branching is opposite, and in fact, when you look at the tips of the branches, you can see this classic opposite arrangement, and that's typical of all maples. All maples have oppositely arranged leaves. Almost all maples have palmately lobed leaves, and this particular Japanese maple has a 7-lobed leaf, and each of these lobes is very, very narrow. All of the lobes have a serrated margin. Not all Japanese maples look like this. Some Japanese maples have shorter, fatter lobes, where the sinus, that is the space between the lobe, where the sinus is much narrower, much shallower. And some Japanese maples have teeth that are drawn out so that the leaf appears more dissected. And that's a fairly common feature of Japanese maples as well. You can see here there are some seeds, and the seeds of maples are produced in pairs, and they're called, technically, the fruit is called a schizocarp. That is a fruit that splits in two, and we normally call the individual fruits, the broken off fruits, we call those samaras. And I think everybody's probably seen that. If you drop a samara, it flies because it has a little wing. And that's a seed dispersal mechanism. So Japanese maple can be distinguished from other maples on the basis of a couple of things. One is there are no hairs. And so I mentioned that vestiture is important in some plants. Well, maples sort of run the gamut of fuzzy to not very fuzzy or completely free of hairs. And the Japanese maple, Acer palmatum, is completely free of hairs on the leaves, the stems, the buds, everything. The other way that we recognize Acer palmatum is that many of the branches terminate in a fork. And so this group of maples that Acer palmatum belongs to are often known as the fork-branched maples. One of the more interesting maples in cultivation is Acer griseum. Acer griseum is unusual not only for its beautiful peeling bark, but also for its leaves. Its leaves are compound leaves. And that might be a surprise to people who know a few maples. I don't know if you could see that, but this is what's known as a trifoliate leaf, 3 separate leaflets. And just do a little trick here to show you that if you put the leaflets together, then it looks a lot more like a maple leaf than with the separate leaflets. But like other maples, the leaves are oppositely arranged. The buds and the leaves are oppositely arranged. And like other maples, the fruits are pairs of samaras. And they fly just like other maples do. Now this is a Chinese species, and it comes from central China in more or less dry mountainsides. And for that reason, it's one of the best maples for an urban situation. It's drought tolerant, it's definitely sun tolerant, and it only looks better the older it gets. So this is a tree that's about 40 years old, and it's really, I think, developed some beautiful bark. Perhaps the only thing that I would say against Acer griseum is that it's so distinctive and so unusual that one has to be careful not to overuse it. It is spectacular in the winter when it's leafless, with more horizontal light that picks up the edges of the peeling bark and kind of lights them up, and that can be pretty spectacular. The autumn color, the leaves, is often red, and that's pretty good too. I would call this very much like Stewartia pseudocamellia. I would call it a 4-season tree. It looks good almost anywhere. The back of the leaf and the seeds, as well as the stalks, are covered in very, very fine hairs, and that's why they appear blue. The leaf backs appear blue. The top of the leaf is without hairs, that is glabrous, and the older twigs are definitely without hairs. Now I can't show you right now the buds, the overwintering buds. Oh yes, I can. They're very, very small at this time of the year, but I'll see if we can get a shot of that. So this is a large deciduous shrub. The name of this is Vitex agnus castus. And Vitex is a member of the mint family, and it's quite aromatic, although it's not aromatic in the same way that, say, spearmint. It's not overly pleasant. It's a little bit musky. It's still, I would say, not unpleasant. It's grown for its flowers. It has flowers that appear in midsummer, and they'll continue for a good 6 weeks or sometimes 2 months, depending on how the weather is. It's been sunny here, and so we're getting lots and lots of flowers. It's a fairly tough plant, heat tolerant, a little bit drought tolerant. Of course, if you want flowers, you don't want to dry it off too much. But it's also very, very distinctive in that the leaves are palmately compound. And we'll get a closer shot of that. But it looks a little bit like a Japanese maple when you look at it like so. But in fact, each one of these lobes is actually a separate leaflet. And so that makes it a compound leaf. But unlike the pinnately compound leaf, there's no rachis, there's no central stalk, there's just the petiole, the leaf stalk, and then each of these leaflets has what's known as a petiolule. That is the diminutive of the petiole. So it's the next set down. And in fact, there are compound leaves that have, a kind of a third level of petiole, and I don't even want to pronounce that. In any case, the mint family is fairly easy to recognize by its flowers, and we'll get a good close shot of that. Mints typically have what are called bilabiate or two-lipped flowers. They're tubular and they have an upper and a lower lip, and they're attractive, very, very attractive to bees, but hummingbirds are also known to visit vitex. Now, vitex is native to Asia and to, I think, Eastern Europe, where there are no hummingbirds, of course, but there are lots of bees. And I think when we get a close-up, we'll see just how many bees are on here, and all kinds of different kinds of bees as well. Now, this is a kind of moderate-sized shrub, and we keep it fairly low, but if you were to allow it to grow to its ultimate size, it's going to be more like 5 meters by 5 meters. So it's a big deciduous shrub, and it has, if you could feel it, you could feel the kind of velvety hairs that clothe the stems and the leaf backs, at least initially. This is Robinia pseudoacacia, which is the black locust. This is a cultivar called freesia. Now, a cultivar is, the word comes from cultivated variety. And so a cultivar is a plant that is perpetuated by people. It's not something that occurs in the wild, but it's something that's selected by people and propagated to maintain it. So what we have here is a plant that is essentially identical to the species Robinia pseudoacacia, except that the leaves are not dark green, they are more yellow-green. And that yellow-green color in the shade appears to be chartreuse, whereas where it's exposed to the sun, it's a little bit kind of brighter yellow. And now at this time of the year, adopting slightly more golden tones. This is a pinnately compound leaf, unlike Coryturia. These leaflets are very, very regular. They're not toothed, they're not lobed, they're essentially oblong, and they have what we would call an entire margin, that is, without teeth or lobes. The rachis is long and slender, and each of the leaflets has its own little petiolule. And some of the leaflets are opposite each other, and some of them are alternate, and we don't worry about that so much. Now, this is a member of the pea family, and in the pea family, compound leaves are very, very common. In fact, they're almost the rule. And so this kind of leaf is very, very common among pea family or pea relatives. The other thing that I want you to recognize about this is that it's a very, very tough, very sun and drought tolerant tree, but that it's a little bit messy. So the interior of the canopy, you'll notice all kinds of dead wood, and it's pretty messy, and the ground beneath Robinia pseudoacacia of any kind is going to be strewn with branchlets and dead leaves and that kind of thing, pretty much the year round. So although it's a good urban tree, it is a little bit messy. And in areas that are very, very windy, it's subject to sort of larger branch breakage. It doesn't happen very much here. So what you don't see on freesia are flowers. Flowers, of course, are occur in June or early June, and the fruit, which are legumes, that is, they look like beans, and they hang in the trees, but only on older specimens. So most Robinia freesia this is what we would call a short-term tree. It's going to be, grows very fast. It's going to look beautiful for about 15, possibly 20 years, and then it's going to start to fall apart. And that's about the same time that it's going to start to flower heavily and produce its fruit.